Okay, so as I said, we're going to talk about avoiding plagiarism and integrating source material smoothly into your writing. But one of the things that you should understand about, especially about citations and documentation, is that a lot of the stuff that you're going to need to know how to cite and document sources is in your handbook. You're not going to memorize a lot of the material. So any writer, including myself, still uses a handbook. You should have one handy or have ready access to the Purdue OWL online, which has all of the necessary information as well. You will have to look up different sources and how to put them on your works cited page. There will be different circumstances that you'll have to look up, like what do you do when a book doesn't have an author, or you don't know the author of a web page. Those sorts of things are not things that you need to memorize about citation. The things that you do need to know about citation is when you have to cite, why you have to cite, and the basics of whatever style you're using, whether it be MLA or APA. For this class, normally we would use MLA. I don't mind if you use APA if that's the style you're more familiar with, but this presentation is going to focus mostly on MLA as an example of what the purpose of the citations and documentation is and how you would go about using and integrating that source material. The specifics of what the parenthetical citation and the works cited or bibliography page looks like are different for each style, and there's more than MLA or APA. There's Chicago and Turabian, which are rarely used, but you may run into them in your college career. So just know that a lot of the stuff that you will need to know about how to specifically cite specific sources is going to be something you're going to look up in a handbook. So the number one thing you need to learn is use your handbook. Become familiar with where the MLA or APA sections are in the handbook and how it's laid out. Or become familiar with the Purdue OWL so that you know where to go. That's your number one resource, is that handbook. So we'll get started on the next slide. As you are probably aware, there are different types of citation styles. The two most common are MLA and APA, but there are others, Chicago, Turabian, and even others beyond that used by very specific fields. And that's what determines what citation style is used, whatever the discipline is that you're working in. So for humanities, English courses, histories courses, you would use MLA. That's the common style used in the published journals of that discipline. The social sciences, on the other hand, use APA, things like psychology, sociology, and it has a different format. So the rules for citing sources in these styles are different, though they all serve the same purpose. So for the purposes of this course, I don't mind if you use APA if that is the style that you are most comfortable with, but if you don't have a preference, then I would prefer that you use MLA, since this is an English class and that is the common citation style used in English classes. And the rest of the presentation is going to talk specifically about MLA. But again, if you use APA, you'll find the same information that I'm presenting for MLA in your handbook under the APA section, or online if you go to the Purdue OWL or Google APA style citation. So there's a lot of different places to get that information, and trying to focus on both at the same time would be a bit tedious in this presentation. So I'm going to use MLA. If you have any questions about APA, then you can come see me or come talk to me or email me. Okay, so the first question that has to be answered is, what kinds of information do you have to cite in your papers? And that answer is pretty straightforward. Okay? Any information that you get from a source, including data, scientific studies, statistics, theories and ideas, certainly any exact wording that you take from a source, any source material that didn't come from your head or is not common knowledge, and I'll explain common knowledge in a moment, has to be cited. And what does it mean for you to cite something? It means that you're going to have a citation in parentheses in the body of your paper after the source material, and that you're going to have, in MLA style, a works cited page at the end of your paper. Okay, so that's full citation, and that's what materials you would need to cite. Okay, now, why do you have to cite? Well, there are several reasons why English teachers harp on this idea so much. For one, it's a question of ethics. Okay? It is theft or stealing when you plagiarize. You are taking credit for something that someone else has written or someone else's ideas, and that's not allowed in writing. Okay? But it's also a way for your reader to trace your research steps. So when a reader reads your paper and they see these pieces of information that are attributed to a particular source, they can then go to your works cited page, and if they want to, they can go directly to your source. Now, scholars do this a lot because they want to see that the person who's writing has not interpreted the source in a way that they may not have, or in a way that bends it towards what their point is instead of sort of looking at it objectively. Okay, so that's another important reason why you have to cite information. And it makes very clear in your paper which of the what part of the information comes from you and what part comes from sources. And that can be very important to a reader. For instance, if most of your information comes from sources and there's very little of your own voice in it, a reader may question your credibility or your ability to speak on a particular topic. Okay, so that's what information you must cite and why you have to even do these very cumbersome citations in your papers. Also, those of you who are analyzing literary text, even if you're only using one text, you still have to cite the text in the body of your paper anytime you summarize information from it or that you take direct quotes from it, which you should be doing to support an analysis, and you have to create a works cited page, even if it's only the story that is your source. Okay? All right, let's move on. Before we get to the specifics of integrating source material into your papers, I just wanted to cover very briefly the 3 ways that you can do that. The first way you're probably very familiar with, and that is by directly quoting a source. That means taking the exact wording and using it in your paper. The second way is summarizing, and the third way is paraphrasing, and I'm going to differentiate between all 3 of these in the next couple of slides. These should be the only ways that you integrate source material. So in other words, all 3 of these ways are things that you should become proficient at in order to be writing at the college level according to the criteria on the Daytona State college level rubric, which is posted on the content page. So we'll move on to more specifics now. The first method for integrating source material, and by first I don't mean the best, but one of the ways that you can integrate source material is by directly quoting the source. And that means that you're using the exact words and you are directly attributing those words to whatever source you're using or the author of that source. Now, one of the biggest issues that students have with using direct quotes is quote plunks or dropped quotes, both of which are used to identify when you have a quotation that does not have a tag or introductory phrase with it. So if your sentence starts with a double quotation mark, ends with a double quotation mark, and there's no words of your own in that sentence, then you have created a quote plunk or a dropped quotation. So you don't want to do that. You always want to have a tag or introductory phrase. Now I've given you an example of a quote plunk on this slide that you're looking at, and you can see that the second sentence begins with a quotation mark, ends with a quotation mark, and there's no words from the writer in that sentence. So they have simply plunked that quote in, and the reader is sort of forced to make a connection between that quote and what has come before or what comes after it. And that connection should be made clearly by the writer. It should be very clear what the quote is being used to illustrate. Now in the correction you see the writer using a tag phrase. He takes the first sentence and he combines it with the quote using saying to himself. So Holden gets frustrated, decides to leave, saying to himself, quote, people are always ruining things for you. Now, this connection is made clear. It reads much more smoothly. The reader isn't left to wonder what this quote is supposed to illustrate for us, and he or she has used the correct citation. This is a parenthetical citation. It will show up in the body of your paper. And here, because the writer has not used the author's name in the tag phrase, the citation will include the author's last name and the page number. Notice that there's no comma in between. So this is correct MLA style. Now also notice that I have given you 3 more sources on the left bottom side of this slide that talk more about effectively integrating quotations, avoiding quote plunks, how to punctuate tag phrases, and intro phrases. So you'll want to take a look at those sources. You should be able to click on them directly from the slide. Okay, so we went over how to insert direct quotes using a tag phrase or an introductory phrase. And this slide covers the different ways that you can insert the tag phrase or introductory phrase. You can put it at the beginning, as in the first example. The tag phrase, according to Levi Strauss, comes before the quote. Notice in that example as well that because the author's name, Levi Strauss, has been mentioned, that the parenthetical citation that follows the quote only has the page number in it. You can also put the tag phrase in the middle of your quote. Teens who watch violent television shows, says Levi Strauss, are more likely to become violent themselves. So still reads smoothly, but you've put that tag phrase or introductory phrase into the middle of the quote. And you can also put it at the end. Teens who watch violent television shows are more likely to become violent themselves, according to Levi Strauss. Now, why do I show you these 3 different ways? Well, because you don't want to introduce your quotes in the same exact way every time you use them in your paper. Variety gives the reader something interesting and engaging to read. If they read the same sort of rhythm for every quote that you put in your paper, then that rhythm can become very monotonous. So you're always in your writing style. And these are stylistic choices. It's not wrong to put your tag phrase or your introductory phrase at the beginning of every single quote. So we're not talking about what's right or wrong here. We are talking about stylistic choices that will raise the sophistication level of your writing. It's subtle, it's a small point, but these are the sorts of things that do raise your sophistication of your writing, and they engage the reader because they require that the reader engage more with the text. Okay? So you'll want to vary the ways that you introduce quotes, and these are 3 ways that you can do that. When you're using source material, one of the things that you have to try to avoid is what I call quotitis. And that's when you rely too heavily on the words of others and have too many direct quotes in your paper. Remember that there's 3 methods for integrating source material, and you should be using all 3, not just directly quoting. In fact, the only time that you should be using direct quotes is when the information is presented very eloquently, when the information is important, and when the information is said in such a way that it captures something about the source that you want to convey to the reader. So minor, unimportant information like the house had 4 windows is not something that you want to directly quote. These quotes should be meaningful and should strike the reader as meaningful and should contain important information. So don't use them frivolously. If you do use too many direct quotes, the effect on your paper is that your voice gets drowned out and the voices of the sources take over your paper. Remember that sources are being used to support your point, not to make it for you. So avoid using too many direct quotes in your papers. And when you drown out your voice with the voice of your sources, it actually calls your credibility into question, because what the reader sees is that you yourself have nothing to say about the topic, and basically what you've done in the paper is gathered a bunch of quotes from a bunch of sources instead of being able to voice your own argument or your own claim or your own analysis, whatever you're doing, on your own. So make sure that the relationship between your quotes and your text is one of a supporting relationship. Don't let it make your argument for you. Okay, so there's a couple of different types of quotes. One is the short quotation. A short quotation is one that is less than 4 lines of prose, and prose means anything that's not poetry or poetic. Okay, so essays, informative articles, news articles, so on and so forth. Or less than 3 lines of poetry. Anything over 4 lines of prose or 3 lines of poetry, you have to format as a long quotation, which we'll get to in the next slide. But if it's less than that amount, then you're going to format it as a short quotation within your paper. So what does that mean? It means that you're going to put double quotation marks around the quoted material. It means that you're going to have a parenthetical citation that directly follows the quoted material. Okay? It should come right after the closing quotation marks, even if that's not where the end of your sentence is. Okay? Again, if the author's last name is mentioned in the introductory or tag phrase, then all you need in the citation is the page number. If not, then you've got to have the author's last name and the page number. Now, in the case where the source material itself is asking a question or has an exclamation mark at the end of it, that punctuation gets included inside the closing quotation marks, not outside the parenthetical citation. Most of the time, your ending punctuation is going to come at the end of the parenthetical citations, as you see in example 3 and example 4. Okay? But if the quote itself contains a question mark or an exclamation mark, you've got to put it with the quote, then the parenthetical, and then you're going to end that sentence with a period, even though it seems like you're using 2 pieces of punctuation for the same sentence. You've got to end that sentence so that you can move on to the next one. So, for example, in example 1, you see Folks asks in his study, at what point do dreams become important for an individual? So that question mark is attached to the quote. It goes within the closing quotation marks. You then have your parenthetical citation, which is just the page number because we've mentioned the author's name, and then your closing period. In example 2, the question is being posed by the writer. It's not within the quote. So the question mark actually goes after the parenthetical citation. In examples 3 and 4, you're seeing normal short quotations. You have a tag phrase, and you can see the difference between the citations where the author's last name is mentioned in the tag phrase and when it's not. Okay, so if you're dealing with a longer quotation, and remember that means longer than 4 lines of prose, longer than 3 lines of poetry, then they are formatted differently within your paper, okay? So, but the first thing you need to know is you shouldn't have a whole lot of block quotes, which is what these longer quotations are called. You should not have a lot of them in your paper. You're probably heading towards quotitis if you do, all right? Certainly don't use them to fill up space. It's very obvious when you do that, okay? But sometimes there are passages that, for instance, describe a character in a certain way or describes a series of steps in a certain way, and so you feel that the entire passage needs to be used in order for whatever you're using it to support to be made clear. Okay, so there's a couple of ways that the formatting is different for a block quote than it would be for a short quote. For one, if you are dealing with a block quote, you're not going to use double quotation marks around it because it gets indented, and that is the signal to the reader that it's a quote. So you don't need the double quotation marks. It becomes redundant. You're going to start the block quotation on a new line. You're going to indent the entire quote an inch from the left margin, and that's using those little left and right arrows that are in your menu bar in Microsoft Word. You're not going to use tab. You're not going to try to space it over. You're going to use indent, and that will move the entire quote over instead of just the first line. You're going to keep the block quote double spaced, just like the rest of the paper should be, including the heading. And this is the only time when the parenthetical citation actually comes after the ending punctuation. So you have your period, then the parenthetical citation. Okay. One thing you have to be careful about when you're using block quotes is that you have to make sure that you introduce the quote adequately, and even more important, that you refer back to the quote after the block quote. So you'll want to explain in your own words what it's saying, or tell the reader how that block quote makes the point that you're trying to make or is relevant to whatever it is that you're trying to do in the paper. Okay? So a block quote should be framed by your own sentences. And you can see an example of that at the bottom of this slide. Shows you the formatting. It's not double spaced just because it's on the slide, but it should be. You can see that at the end of the quote, you have the period, then the parenthetical citation, instead of how it would normally be with a short quote. And notice that there is a sentence of the writer's after the quote that explains how that passage is relevant. Don't just simply plunk it in there and expect the reader to figure out how it's relevant to what you're trying to say. Okay, so we've covered how to use direct quotes when you want to use the exact wording of a source in your paper. The second method for integrating source material into your papers is summary. And summarizing is really simple, really straightforward. It's very short, a sentence or two. It only captures the main idea of the source material, not the precise details. It doesn't give you the entire picture. It's just going to use the main idea of the source material. And I'm going to have examples of this in a couple of slides. But for instance, if you just wanted to, if you're reading, Darwin's Origin of the Species, and you just want to state his main argument. Darwin says that human beings come from apes. Okay? that is a summary of the main idea and wouldn't require direct quotation marks, is very short and only captures that main idea instead of any of the details that he uses to support that idea. Despite the fact that it's not a direct quote, you still must write this in your own words, and you must use a parenthetical citation after summarized material, as well as place that source on your works cited page. So any source material, whether you summarize it, paraphrase it, or directly quote it, still has to be cited in the body of your paper and still has to be on your MLA-style works cited page if you're using MLA. Okay, so on to paraphrasing. Now, paraphrasing is a little more complex than summary. It's also going to be longer than a summary is. And there might be several reasons why you would want to paraphrase from a source rather than directly quote it or summarize it. And those instances are listed here on this slide. So when you want to use a source's information, but you don't necessarily want to use the language that the sources use, right? Then you would paraphrase it, okay? When a source explains a concept that might be confusing to the reader or that you think is confusing and you could explain it more clearly or perhaps give an analogy that is going to be clearer for your readers, then you would use a paraphrase. So you're not just trying to capture the main idea, you are trying to state the ideas of the source, but you're going to use your own words to explain them more clearly to your reader or relate it back to what you're trying to do in your paper. Another time you might use paraphrasing is if the source, like a scientific text, uses really technical terms that your audience is probably going to get hung up on, then you're going to want to paraphrase that material rather than use its language, okay? Also, when you're using a lot of source material, if you paraphrase it rather than directly quote it, it avoids quotitis, and because it's in your own words, your own voice doesn't get drowned out by the source material. And also, when you're not trying just to capture the main idea, but you need some of the details that the source uses, you would also paraphrase. Now, how do you paraphrase? Well, one thing you don't do, and this is the caution that's at the bottom of the slide, is take a sentence from a source and then simply start substituting words, the major words in the sentence. That is plagiarism, because what you've basically done is taken the entire sentence, the structure of the sentence, the flow of the words, the order of the words, and you have basically borrowed all of that from the source and only substituted a few of your own words. You cannot do that, okay? So you've got to rewrite it entirely in your own words to avoid plagiarism. Now, paraphrases are normally very close to the length of the original text because you are trying to capture everything that's in that passage. So they're longer than summaries. And like I said, the tricky part about paraphrasing is that you avoid plagiarism. And as I've said before, in the assessment that you took at the end of whatever writing course you may have been in last semester, you were asked to choose the best paraphrase for a passage, and that was the question that students across the board in every 1101 and 1102 class did poorly on. Only 50% of students got that question right. So paraphrasing is something that you really do need to conscientiously work on, because it really is one of the more sophisticated ways to integrate source material into your paper when you're not in need of the specific language as you might be with a direct quote, or when you need to capture more than just the main idea as you would in a summary. Okay, so what you see on this slide are examples of how you might integrate a passage from a source through direct quotation, through paraphrase, and through summary. And I've also given you a plagiarized version of this so that you can make sure that you understand how you could plagiarize source information like this, even when you might not think you are. Okay, so the original source is at the top. This is directly from the source, and it says students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. Okay, so this is even relevant to what we're talking about here. Now, if you wanted to pull something out of that passage and directly quote it, you can see how I've done that. According to James Lester, only about 10% of your final manuscript should be direct quotes. Notice that I have a tag phrase, I've put quotation marks around it, and I have included in the parenthetical citation the page number because I've already mentioned the author, and I have the ending punctuation after the parenthetical citation. Now notice in the paraphrase that not only are the words changed, but they are changed around. The order is different. So this is a legitimate paraphrase. In research papers, students often quote excessively, failing to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. Since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. So notice that they have captured, this is almost just as long as the source, but they have managed to capture not only the main idea that students use quotes too much, but they have also captured some of those supporting details that the original source includes. It's completely in the student's own words. It doesn't simply use the structure of the passage and substitute a couple of words. It reorganizes the entire passage. That's a legitimate paraphrase. Now, the summary, much shorter than the original passage, is only one sentence long. Students should take just a few notes in direct quotation from sources to help minimize the amount of quoted material in a research paper. And I think you could even make that shorter. You could even summarize that in short form. Okay. Now the plagiarized version, as you can see, takes only a couple of the words and replaces them with the student's own words, but basically it borrows the exact same structure of the passage, puts the information in the same order. So it sounds very much like the source, and that's one way that you can tell that you've plagiarized instead of paraphrased or summarized. A good way to test this is to read the original source, read your version, and see how similar they sound. If they sound too similar, then you've probably got more work to do. Now, the passage itself actually brings up a good point, and that is that plagiarism often occurs not in the drafting of a paper, but when a student is taking notes from a source. So one of the methods that I've developed for my own writing is that I will read a passage in a source, and if I know I'm not going to directly quote that passage and want to summarize or paraphrase it, then I will close the source and I will try to write my summary or paraphrase of it without looking directly at the source. It's a very good way to avoid copying the source too closely. Okay? Now, if you're directly quoting, obviously that doesn't matter, but that's one way of ensuring. Do it from the very first stage of using source material, and that's in your note-taking. Okay? You certainly don't ever want to copy and paste things from electronic sources. That's just heading for trouble in plagiarism. Okay? So always try to close the source, write your paraphrase, and you're much more likely to get a legitimate paraphrase out of it. But to check it, make sure that you read your passage next to, and I would recommend doing this out loud, next to the source passage so that you can make sure that it's not too similar and that you don't wind up plagiarizing unintentionally. Okay, so what do you do if, say, you need to omit part of a passage? You need some of the passage from the beginning, and you need some of the passage from the ending, and you don't want everything in between because you've listened to Miss T warn you about quotitis and you only want to take the material that you want. Can you change a direct quote from a source? Well, normally, being very exact in your quoting is really important, and you shouldn't change a quote. Why? As I've listed here, because it's really an undermining of your credibility. If you make a typing mistake or a mechanical mistake and just copy wrong, that undermines your credibility just like poor grammar would, okay? Because it shows that you're not being careful. And you should be very careful that when you're directly quoting somebody else's words that you get it right. Another reason why it's important to get it right is because if you take out words or change words in a quotation, you will often make that direct quote say something that it actually doesn't. Or if you only take pieces of a passage that don't really say what you're trying to make it say, but you put it in your paper in such a way that it appears that the passage says something it doesn't. That's unethical. You can't do that, okay? Take direct quotes at their face value in the context in which they have been written, instead of trying to make them forcefully fit whatever you're trying to say. If you can't get a source to say what you needed to say, find another source. However, there are times when you might need to change minor parts of a quote, not its meaning, just the mechanics or the formatting in order to get it to flow smoothly with your text. For instance, if you are using past tense in your paper and the quote is in present tense, you might want to change the verb to a past tense so that it won't seem jarring to the reader. It won't change so that the reader has to sort of reorient themselves, okay? So if you are trying to simply make minor changes in the formatting or mechanics of a quote to make it flow more smoothly, that's okay. Also, if there's any ambiguity in the quote, in other words, for instance, you're taking part of a passage. You have a paragraph in the source. You're not taking the top part of the paragraph, but you're taking the bottom part of the paragraph. And that bottom part has the word he in it. And that he is clear if you read the whole paragraph because the first part of the paragraph told us who this he was. But in the second part, the writer has used a pronoun because it's clear who it is, but you're only taking the second part to quote, so you may need to replace that he with a name or a clarification of who that's referring to. So anytime there are ambiguous references in the piece of quote that you take, you are allowed to clarify that. All right? And as I stated earlier, if you don't want to take an entire passage, but you need parts of it in different places, then you can sort of chop it up. You still want it to read smoothly, and avoid using the parts of the passage that you really don't need and that would border on quotitis. Now, how do you do that? Okay, there are signals that you use to your reader that tell the reader that you've done one of these things for one of these reasons. And one of those signals is an ellipsis, which is 3 periods with a space in between each one. An ellipsis indicates that you have removed material. So in that example I gave about taking the middle of a quote out and using the beginning and the end. When you change a word or you clarify an ambiguity, you're going to put brackets, and you see those on this slide. Okay? So those are the legal ways to change a quote when you need to change the formatting or mechanics simply to make it flow more smoothly with your text. And I recommend that you do that. okay? Because you want to establish that smooth flow. Now, if you end up having to change, a majority of the words in a quotation, the verb tense or whether it's singular or plural, then you probably need to reconsider how you're using it and fit it in a different way. All right, so you don't want to see a whole quote with brackets around it. All right, so the ellipsis and the brackets, that's what you use in order to indicate that you have made a minor, not meaning change to a direct quote. Okay, so you need to eliminate part of a quotation that you're using. So you're going to need to use an ellipsis. And as I said on the last slide, you use 3 periods with that are preceded and followed by a space. Okay, and that's an ellipsis mark. So I've given you an example here where a student has taken out part of the source material because they didn't need the details in the middle of the passage. So it reads, in an essay on urban legends, Jan Harold Brunvin notes that some individuals make a point of learning every recent rumor or tale, ellipses, and in a short time a lively exchange of details occurs. Right? So notice that it still makes sense. It still flows smoothly as a sentence. So you don't want to take out so much material that it then no longer makes sense or sounds really choppy. But obviously this writer did not need the material that was in between these two parts and only wanted to capture this main idea. All right? So the rest of the details weren't relevant to the writer's thesis, and they have reduced the amount of material they're quoting and thus avoided quotitis. All right? Couple of things that you want to consider. All right? Make sure, as I have warned in the last slide, make sure that you don't change the meaning of a passage that you take material out of. All right? That would be unethical. You don't want to do that. And if you have a quoted text that ends up with more ellipses than words, then you might consider, instead of directly quoting it, paraphrase it. Okay? These changes, ellipses and brackets, really should not be numerous in your paper. Okay? So that's how to use an ellipsis. Now we're going to move on to how to use brackets. Okay, so now brackets. And as I told you before, you can use brackets to make minor changes to the material in a direct quotation. And that's, when you want to make it flow more smoothly with your text, or when you want to clarify something in the quotation that's ambiguous. Okay? So, here we have an original. Dillard was stunned into stillness as he was emerging from beneath an enormous shaggy wild rose bush 4 feet away. Okay? Now, here, the he may be unclear. It could be Dillard, and that's our first assumption, but it may be Dillard watching somebody do this, right? So, as we can see with the correction that uses the brackets, it actually isn't Dillard. And with the brackets we have Dillard was stunned into stillness as the weasel, in brackets, was emerging from beneath an enormous shaggy wild rose bush. Okay? So you can see here how it's being used in order to clarify an ambiguous, usually it's a pronoun, in the original quote. All right? Okay, so we're going to continue with brackets, and on this slide you have an example of how you might use brackets in order to make the flow of your paper when you're integrating a quotation smooth. So notice that in the original, Staples, who is writing the article that's being referred to here, uses the first person I. You can see that in the bottom line, I whistle melodies from Beethoven and Vivaldi. Well, the writer who is writing about this article refers to Staples naturally as he. So because Staples is using the verb tense that would agree with I, The writer has a subject-verb disagreement here. He, employ. Okay? So to fix that, what the writer can do is change the verb tense of employ as it's shown down here at the bottom of the slide. And so he adds the S. Now notice that the brackets are not around the entire word because he doesn't change the entire word. He only changes this S. So that's what you put the brackets around. And notice as well that instead of putting the part of the quote that says, I whistle melodies, this writer rewords that so that he can take the I out and refer to Staples as he, and it reads much more smoothly than that original. So this is how you might use brackets in order to smooth out a quote integration. Just make sure that when you do this that you're not changing the meaning. Now that we have covered how to integrate source information so that it reads smoothly in your paper, how to change quotations, under what circumstances you can do that, and I've basically covered MLA-style citations, in-text citations, parenthetical citations, a couple of different times on these different slides, but I just want to make sure that we are clear about what it means to cite in MLA style. MLA style requires, as does every other style of citation, it requires two different parts: citation and documentation. Citation refers to that parenthetical citation or in-text citation that's actually in the body of your paper. So when you've directly quoted something, it comes directly after that quotation. If you have summarized or paraphrased something, it comes after that paraphrase or summary. Now, direct quotation is the only time when it has to directly follow it, but if you say paraphrase an entire paragraph, then you don't have to put that citation after every sentence. You can wait until the end of the paragraph if it's from the same source. If it's from different sources, then you've got to put that citation at the end of each source. Okay? Now, most of the time, these parenthetical citations are going to have the author's last name and a page number. If you use the author's last name in a tag phrase, as I've mentioned before, you only need to include the page number in the parenthetical citation. Okay? Documentation is the works cited page. It's the final page of your paper, and it contains the full bibliographic information for each of the sources that you have cited in the paper. In the paper, you've only given us an author's name most of the time and a page number, whereas in the works cited page, you're giving us not only the author's name, but the title of the source, where the source was published, who the source was published by, and when the source was published, as well as where you got it, whether it's an online source or a print source. Okay, so each of them serves a different purpose, but there is a one-to-one correlation between them. In other words, you cannot have a source listed on your works cited page that isn't contained in a parenthetical citation in your paper, that isn't actually cited in the paper. So if you don't use it in the paper itself through paraphrase, summary, or direct quote, it can't show up on your works cited page. Same thing, the reverse goes the same way. If you have a source that's cited in your body text, you've got to make sure that that source is listed on your works cited page. So I always check this, and it's really easy to check. Just go through your paper wherever you have a parenthetical citation, check the source on the works cited page off. And if you find that you have sources that don't have a check mark, then you haven't cited them in the paper and you need to eliminate them from the works cited page. Or if you have citations that aren't listed in your works cited page, you've got to make sure to add them. Now understand this, however you have your works cited entries formatted, and the way to figure out how to format each of these different types of sources is to use a handbook. But if in the parenthetical citation in your paper you have the author's first name or last name, then that should be the first word in the Works Cited entry on your Works Cited page. If, for instance, you have a source that doesn't have an author, in a parenthetical citation, you're going to use part of the title in quotation marks. So if that's what you have as the first thing in your in-text citation, it should be the first thing that's listed in your Works Cited entry. Okay, so whatever you have in that parenthetical citation, I should be able to find an entry on the Works Cited page that starts with whatever it is that's in that citation. Okay, we've talked about already if you have an author's name in the tag phrase, you don't have to put it in the citation. And you'll see at the bottom of this slide an example of a Works Cited entry. And you wouldn't put MLA before it. That's just a label to clarify it for you. But you can see here that it starts with the author's last name, then the first name, then the title of the work, then the location of where it was published, and the press that published it, along with the copyright date. The copyright date can always be found on the inside cover of the book or inside the title page, and you should use the latest date published unless it specifies that it is an earlier edition. Okay, so the most important thing is that citation and documentation go together. You can't have one thing without the other. And in order to figure out what to put in a parenthetical citation and what information has to be contained in the Works Cited entry, you're going to have to use a handbook which will list them according to what type of source. Is it a book? Is it a magazine article? Is it a newspaper article? All of those require different information in the Works Cited entry, so you've got to make sure that you look them up. If you have any question about what kind of source you're dealing with, you can ask me or go to the Writing Center or go to the Academic Support Center or the library. In any of those places you can find help. So what I've done is I have linked a sample Works Cited page to this slide, but that sample is also linked on the content page. So take a look at it, because the formatting for the Works Cited page itself is very detailed and has particular rules, and you'll want to make sure that you are formatting according to those rules. The sample that I have posted has comments on it to tell you what the different features of the MLA Works Cited page are, how it should look, what order you should list your sources in, how to format each of those entries, etc. Okay, so make sure that you take a look at that sample Works Cited page when you are creating your first Works Cited page to make sure that you have the format correct. Formatting does count in your grade for the papers in this course, as well as the rough drafts that you turn in. So you'll want to make sure that you are looking these things up that you're not familiar with. And there's no way that anybody can memorize all of that. So using a handbook is almost always necessary. I still use one every time I write. Okay? So take a look at that. And the next page that you see that has the polar bears on it contains several links that actually are on individual slides. Most of them are on individual slides in the presentation itself, but